In December 2022, I became the first member of my family to return to Cuba in over 70 years. Getting there was a matter of chance and free will, and involves my family of exiles, 2 decades of living and studying internationally, and a sacred tree. Welcome to Once Upon a Time in Havana. This is the true story behind Havana Syndrome. The true story behind the podcast. The upcoming, premiering in November, fictional podcast, of course. Not the, supposed mysterious attacks that has plagued intelligence agents, diplomats, and military officials, triggered multiple hearings on the Hill, and remains publicly unsolved to this day. I do not know about the inner machinations of such secrets, folks. Or do I?
Today, I can announce that the United States has agreed to formally reestablish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Cuba.
You know there's story going around about the CIA and they're trying to get, sending in the folks to get Castro.
Cuba maintains close relations with Russia and China, providing these actors with influence platforms to foment an anti-American
Florida
agenda.
State Court has ruled on the case regarding temporary custody of Elián González.
You ought to have that. It's incredible. I don't believe this thing in the world could. I don't think they ought to seriously consider it, but I think you ought to know about it.
The progress that we mark today is yet another demonstration that we don't have to be imprisoned by the past. When something isn't working, we can and will change.
I'm Lisette Alvarez, creator and producer of this show. I am an audio drama writer and actor. I am also a digital strategist and hold a bachelor's and master's degree in international affairs. I'm an Air Force brat who spent most of my childhood moving between 3 continents. My dad is Cuban, my mom is Canadian, they met in Texas, and I was in 4 high schools in 4 years. I and my siblings are considered third culture kids. Namely, children of the military, diplomats, and international business people who have lived abroad in multiple countries outside of their and their parents' native culture. On this meta podcast series, I'm going to walk you through the real inspirations behind why I wanted to create a show like Havana Syndrome. Personal, political, and historical inspirations. Why? 1, I think it will help you better understand the context that drives the characters in this upcoming augmented reality spy thriller. And 2, because, personally, I have a problem with the aggressive ignorance on the part of U.S. citizens towards our international policies. Don't get me wrong, that ignorance is manufactured. However, that ignorance also allows nationalism to fester and media literacy to drop. That ignorance rewards certain industrial complexes to thrive at the expense of immense suffering here and abroad. That ignorance has fractured my sense of self as a third culture kid and fostered a kind of loneliness that few people understand. It made me vulnerable to recruitment by the very same agency that has been central to removing access to the kind of intelligence that would inform the public about the United States' bungled activities and priorities across the world. So, I'm going to dust off my 2 international affairs degrees and take some time to chip away at that ignorance. I plan to review U.S. and Cuba history and contemporary relationship, pop culture's honestly shallow references to Cuba, don't get me started on the lack of modern references, other world powers' activities in Latin America, as well as some International Affairs 101, so you can better understand the vocabulary used when referring to international policy and politics. I'm also going to be candid about my personal experience and my family's. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's as opaque as the syndrome we're investigating here. But let me rewind a bit, back to December 2022. That music you heard at the top of this episode? That was a covert recording from my trip to Havana, at a bar I was probably not allowed to frequent according to the United States Department of Treasury, or Well, it wasn't very clear about what I was and wasn't allowed to do in Cuba, to be perfectly honest. We are told not to spend any money at any establishment run by the Cuban government. But there's no clear indicator which restaurant, hotel, or bar was run by the government. I mean, I used the Cuban airport to arrive. Isn't that run by the government? At the end of the day, there is no way for the U.S. to track where you spend your money there, considering our credit and debit cards don't work there. I had to bring all the cash I needed for 5 days. Cash is not impossible, but it is kind of hard to trace, especially internationally, right? Even with my seasoned travel experience and research skills, there was more clear public information about how a U.S. citizen can travel around North Korea or Iran than there was about Cuba, an island that took less than 45 minutes to fly to from Miami. Granted, it's mostly because those governments in those countries are more authoritarian about the movements of foreigners in their borders, but I digress. It was a Friday, December 9th, 2022. I was in the middle of writing Havana Syndrome, and I was itching to gift myself a last-minute writing retreat before the holidays with family. I had some airline points I could use, and a limited budget. I was thinking that I would be limited to the United States, considering I wanted to travel that coming Monday. So I was poking around itineraries to Boston, to Seattle, maybe to Jamaica or Cancun. But last-minute hotel and Airbnb prices are outrageous. And then I see a little pin in the awards map just south of Florida. Surely, I thought to myself, I didn't have enough points to get me to Cuba if they weren't enough to get to LA, right? Surely, with such restrictions, it would be impossible for me to book a trip to a country my family hasn't set foot in for 70 years. In just 3 days? And yet, the points didn't lie. I had enough to fly me there practically for free. But then there was the rest of my budget. Last-minute Caribbean vacations homes are expensive, and I knew I wasn't allowed to book a regular hotel in Cuba, but I figured might as well browse Airbnb. What's the harm? I looked up a casa particulare, a private home, with a panoramic ocean view right on the famous Malecón in Havana, for the exact 5 days I wanted to travel. For those exact 5 days, prices were slashed almost 75%. The universe was speaking to me. I started to shake, like ghosts of the past were vibrating out of my very blood, my bones. 70 years. 3 days. A monumental collapse in time and space. I dove into research. Surely I couldn't go to Cuba in just 3 days without a massive amount of red tape and bureaucracy to navigate. I looked into blogs, travel companies, government websites, anything that would tell me how I could possibly do this. There was nothing up to date. The last blog by a U.S. citizen was written during the Obama administration. It was not clear if those recommendations were out of date. The U.S. Department of Treasury site listed legitimate reasons for traveling to Cuba, you would claim, one being support for the Cuban people, which is what most U.S. tourists pre-2017 used to travel to Cuba. But this was 2022. In 2015, President Barack Obama reopened the U.S. Embassy in Havana in a historic move late in his final term. While many aspects of the embargo remained, commercial flights were able to fly directly to Cuba from the United States. For the first time, U.S. citizens could visit Cuba without going through other countries and other back channels. However, in 2019, then President Trump stopped commercial travel to Cuba outside of Havana, drastically reversing the Obama administration's normalization of relations. I don't think it's a coincidence that all this coincided with reports of Havana syndrome. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and Cuba closed its borders until spring of 2022. President Biden restored broader relations and commercial travel to Cuba in July 2022, with American Airlines restarting more regular flights just weeks before I opened that airline's rewards map. So with all this back and forth, there weren't a lot of casual solo travelers who experienced going to Cuba, let alone write about it, so I had no idea what really applied. And there were only scant references to picking up day of visas in Miami in a Aviator comments section. It wasn't even clear if I could pick up that visa at the gate or if I would have to exit security and re-enter after. But there was nothing that explicitly said no. No, Lisette, you need a cooling off period, a waiting period. You need all this documentation, whatever. Nothing was actually telling me, no, you can't get to Cuba in 3 days. I texted my spouse. Wouldn't it be funny if I randomly went to Cuba on Monday? Do it, he replied. As if it was that simple. Was it that simple? Turns out, it was. I booked the flight. I booked the Airbnb. I was going to Cuba in 3 days. I needed to tell my family. But I'll get to that in another episode. Don't worry. I'll cover my trip to Cuba too, throughout Once Upon a Time in Havana. Stay tuned, and thank you for listening.